Okay, good evening, friends. So let us start with the topic of today. And first, we are going to talk about the political models and theories, which, as we had discussed, that we have to complete. So, from this topic, in paper one, there are two topics which are mentioned as a part of political models and theories. And if you talk about the first one, is definitely the Heartland and the Rimland theories. So we will be taking two questions related with one on Heartland and the other one on the Rimland. Just before I continue, I hope that I am audible and visible to all of you. Be very quick in answering. Okay, very good. So Heartland and Rimland theories, two questions I have taken up. Obviously, you can understand this year they didn't ask any question on the political aspects. That means for next year, 2025, there is an expectation that questions can be asked. And the second topic which is mentioned in the syllabus is the laws of international boundaries and frontiers. And here I have taken up two questions because there are two type of questions. If you look into the PYQs have been asked. One is the difference between boundaries and frontiers. That is one category of questions, and related with the classification of the types of frontiers and boundaries. So that is one category of questions. And second type of question, like for example, you can see this was asked in 2008, and this was described the laws of international boundaries and frontiers. Okay, so here, particularly related with this question, there is scarcity of material. Okay, so I have given some material on the laws of international boundaries and frontiers. So you will find that ultimately हम देखेंगे कि I have given some material on this also. ठीक है. So these four questions we have to discuss today. Although they are just four in numbers, but they will be taking time. So let us start with the discussion of these questions. So first question, if you talk about, is question number one, which is the Heartland theory is gaining importance once again. In this, I could have reframed this question in many ways. Uh, what is the contemporary utility of Heartland theory, etc., etc. But what I did, I picked up one of the PYQs, and can you see this was asked in 2017. This question was asked, the Heartland theory is gaining importance once again. Comment. Okay. So again, if you talk about, there is a possibility that the question can be asked. ठीक है. You can understand कि चाहे वो contemporary relevance आए या इससे related many type of wordings can be used. Basically, the content is not going to change. Okay. So content will be very similar thing that you will be writing. So that is why I picked up the PYQ. That is a more suitable one to answer. So the Heartland theory is gaining importance once again. Now, before we continue with this question, you have to basically understand the aspect of the Heartland theory. So you can understand that first in 1904, Mackinder, if you talk about, gave this conception of the pivot area. So this was his pivot area. He described it as the pivot. Which was essentially Russia and parts of Central Asia. They were described as the pivot. Then if you talk about later on in 1919, what he did, he expanded this pivot area. Can you see now these dotted lines? To include various parts of Eastern Europe, if you talk about, also in case of Central Asia. So this was the new pivot, and this new pivot, as you understand, was referred to as the uh, Heartland by him. Okay, so you know basic. I hope that all of you know the basics of the theory. So essentially, you can see this was his Heartland, and this were the areas which were essentially controlled by him. So, देखो, what I'm just trying to make you understand is कि you know कि if you talk about the case of Mackinder, he was essentially a historical geographer, and he was using geography to interpret history. And when he studied history from the geographical point of view, he came to understand that ultimately, if you talk about the area which was essentially the Central Asia, Caucasus, okay, etc. These were the areas which have always historically threatened Europe. Okay, so in different time periods, what he found that these were the areas which had threatened Europe. So I think I have given one diagram. Yes, this is the diagram which I am talking about. If you look into this diagram of the concept of the pivot area, you can understand that he goes, or if you go back to very past 4th and 5th century, you find that there was Hun Empire which originated and which became again threatening for the integrity of Europe. Then in the 6th to 10th century, there was the Khazar Khanates, which ultimately, if you talk about threatened the integrity of Europe. Then in 7th to 13th century, there were Arabian caliphates, which again were threatening the case of Europe. 11th to 12th century, if you talk about, there was Empire of Seljuks, which was again a danger to Europe. Then, you know, 13th to 14th century, a very big danger in the form of Mongolian Empire emerged from the Central Asian region. Then 14th to 15th, again there was Timur's Empire. 15th century, there was emergence of Ottoman Empire. Again, it remained for long period of time. Then, if you talk about 16th century, there was Safavid Empire, which also was threatening. And now he could see that there was also emergence of what the Russian Soviet Empire, which was threatening to Europe. So, what was the basic idea of pivot? Here we have to understand. He gave the conception, on the basis of this, he gave the conception of pivot. Okay. So, what is essentially the case of pivot? Pivot is the area, it is the geographical area which is threatening to the sovereignty and integrity of Britain. Because he was writing from the perspective of Britain, we can also perceive it as the West. Okay. So such area, if you talk about, is referred to as what? It is referred to as the pivot or pivot area. Okay. So that is why, as we said here, in first case, when he wrote in 1904, he first identified this part as where Russia and parts of Central Asia were taken as the pivot. And here he is actually naming them as the pivot. And then what he finds that ultimately there he extends this idea after the First World War. So in 1909, he extends the area to include more parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. and now he called it as the Heartland. So Heartland was nothing but the pivot. Now this basic idea of Mackinder, if you talk about, was based upon certain principles of his or certain assumptions of his. So one of his assumption, we can definitely call it as an assumption, was that ultimately he believed that the Columbian era of naval power supremacy was coming to an end. And what he felt that what will be the case? The future geopolitics will be determined by the land-based powers. By the land-based powers. So, during the colonial period, the naval supremacy was very important. But now he felt that land-based forces will dominate. Particularly, he was very apprehensive of the case of Russia and the Soviet Union, because this represented a very, very vast area with huge amount of resources. Okay, and essentially, he also interpreted this with the aspect of history, where, as we have seen throughout historical time period, we can see that there were number of threats to Europe emerged from this same region of Central Asia and this Caucasian region. So he was very apprehensive that the same thing, the history is going to essentially repeat itself. Okay, so that is the basic conception of his concept of pivot area. I hope it is clear. And that is why he was talking about ultimately the case of how Russia and Soviet Union will be dangerous for the West. Please tell me, friends, so that I can ultimately continue. Okay, so the basic, if you talk about, of the entire Heartland theory is this same conception of pivot or pivot area. And the Heartland, if you talk about, was considered as that pivot area. Okay, and it is pretty much clear, this Heartland, if you look again at the diagram which we have seen, that this Heartland is basically Russia and parts of Eastern Europe, which were and Central Asia, which were part of Eastern Europe. Now the idea, now coming to the question, if we look at the question, the Heartland theory is gaining importance once again. Comment. Okay. So if I have to answer this question, definitely you can understand कि इसके framework में हमें दो बातें समझनी होगी. Heartland theory in its essence, if you talk about, or in its wordings first, if you talk about, in its literal sense, if you talk about, what it says, it talks about the threat posed by the Heartland. Heartland, that is, practically it was Russia to the West. So this is the literal sense of the theory. Okay. And second, if you talk about the another sense of the theory, is that it is actually the case of threat posed by the pivot ठीक है. And pivot, can you understand? Pivot can shift in time to the west. So when you are assessing the contemporary relevance of the theory, or whether the theory is relevant in contemporary times, you have to understand it from these two aspects. You have to analyze it from these two aspects. One thing is very very clear कि ये जो पहली वाली बात आ रही है, और why this question has come into being, or why this question is being asked these days. The idea is very simple कि आज की डेट में अगर हम देखें तो, for example, Russia has become very aggressive. And this aggressiveness of Russia could be seen in what was essentially happening in what has happened in Ukraine. So almost you can understand that Russia attacked Ukraine, and almost now the in matter of months it seems like the war will wind up and Russia will emerge as the winner. Okay, so that is one thing. Same thing you can see that how actively it is involved in Middle East. Okay, it is asserting itself also in Africa now. So many places, if you talk about, there is involvement of Russia. Okay, so now the question arises, will Russia, if you talk about, be again a threat? Okay, in the sense of that same Heartland, will it be a threat to the West? That is something which we have to assess. That is first thing. Now, when you assess this part, you can sort of, that is what I am talking about. When you assess this part, we can come to the conclusion that Russia alone cannot ultimately threaten the West. ठीक है, because हम देखें अगर रशिया में, तो there are in several problems Russia is facing. ठीक है, there is still, if you talk about, it's the aspect of economic diversity. In case of Russia, it is lacking its industrialization process. If you talk about, it hasn't diversified. In case of Russia, Russia is still facing the problem of population decline and various such kind of problems. Okay, so alone, if you look into, one thing we can definitely say that Russia alone is not a threat. Okay, but the question is that is the threat still there to the integrity of the West? In a way, it is. Like for example, if you look into, can we say कि अगर हम Heartland theory को literal sense में न लें, or and we take it in what is the essence of the Heartland theory. So essence of the Heartland theory is this concept of pivot. And this concept of pivot, if you talk about, it is emerging from where? It is emerging not from just from Russia. If you talk about, it is emerging from number of places. Like for example, today the biggest threat which the West sees is not Russia but China. In fact, not only China, but in fact you can say it is the combined multipolarity which is essentially emerging. So for example, along with China, there is the case of Russia is also asserting itself. But no doubt China is a bigger threat, most biggest threat that the West has ever faced. Because China, if you talk about, it is the second most populous country in the world. It is a very highly industrialized nation. Technology wise, it has grown very fast. Okay, and if you talk about at present, its technology has become very advanced. Similarly, if you talk about economically, if you talk about, it is a very big superpower, unlike what was the case of Russia. Okay, so in many contexts, if you talk about, China is actually emerging as the main threat. So now what has happened geographically, the pivot has shifted. Okay, so pivot has essentially shifted. No doubt, if you talk about the idea of Heartland, because China, if you look into where it is located, can I say China is located not in the Heartland, but it is located in the insular crescent? That is, if you talk about in the Rimland. I hope you are getting my point. Okay, so it is not exactly, if you talk about, the Heartland, but can we say that the concept he has given, that is the concept of pivot, is it still very relevant? because the basic idea is that pivot area, and pivot area is the area which is threat to the integrity of the West, to the sovereignty and integrity of the West. I hope you get my point. तो ये दो एस्पेक्ट से हम हमें अपने आंसर को लिखना है, ठीक है. So now let us see how we'll be writing our answer. So we can definitely start with an introduction where we can say, because the question is asking the Heartland theory is gaining importance once again. Okay, so we can start with the most relevant news which has been there. So the emergence of Russia Ukraine emergence of the Russia Ukraine war along with recent resurgence of Russia in geopolitics has heightened interest in the Heartland theory of Mackinder. ठीक है. Then I will come to the main body. So if you talk about the main body, we can definitely say here you can make the diagram. ठीक है. So very clearly this diagram should be made here. So which was actually the earlier pivot and then the pivot area changed. So this was the idea which was there. Then I'll start saying that ये जो हमने यहाँ पे assertion की बात की, resurgence की बात की, now we have to talk about that resurgence. So we can say one of the clearest examples of the theory's resurgence is seen in recent actions of Russia in Ukraine. If you talk about Crimea, Central Asia, and Middle East, and the Middle East. So इसको elaborate कर देंगे. For example, I can say Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, its influence uh, in Central Asia, and its 2022 invasion of Ukraine reflect the growing assertiveness of Russia in recent times. In recent times. Besides, it is well known that Russia, through its proxies, played important role in the Syrian crisis. In the contemporary uh, standoff in Middle East, Russia continues to show its might by supporting Iran and its allies. Okay. So, in recent times, Russia has given several important sophisticated arms to Iran. Okay. So, that is, we can say this along with the economic improvements in Russia after the breakup of Soviet Union. So this, along with the economic improvements in Russia, which occurred after breakup of Soviet Union, have made scholars rethink on the utility of Heartland theory. Utility of the Heartland theory to understand the contemporary geopolitics. To understand the contemporary geopolitics. ठीक है. So first part we have done here. हमने दो पार्ट बनाए थे, उसमें फर्स्ट पार्ट हमने आधा कंप्लीट कर लिया. Then I'll say that this idea seems lucrative at first instance, but when analyzed in detail several problems emerge. Several problems emerge. It is clear that Russia alone does not poses much bigger threat to the West due to its own issues. तो अगर हम इन इश्यूज की बात करें, फॉर एग्जाम्पल वी फाइंड व्हाट स्टिल Russia's economy lacks diversification. ठीक है, it is heavily dependent upon arms export and natural gas, right? Natural gas exports. ठीक है, and here also we find that it is facing competition in its traditional markets. ठीक है, for example, in case one traditional market was India. So you know that ultimately what India has begun. India is not only now importing arms from, if you talk about Russia, but it is importing arms from France, Britain, US. Okay, so from many countries, from Israel. So now there is a very stiff competition. This is the reason why in recent times we'll be finding Russia's closeness with other countries. In fact, one of the enemy countries of India, that is Pakistan, has essentially increased. So this has forced Russia to look for other markets. Okay, same has been happening in natural gas. So there was a ban in the natural gas case in case of Europe, which was the main market of Russia, and thus Russia has seeking new markets in India, China, and other parts of the world. So there it is facing stiff competition, and thus if you talk about, although there has been economic improvements, the economic troubles have not totally vanished. So we can say thus, despite economic improvements, the economic troubles have not completely vanished. So this is one big problem with Russia. Russia is also facing several other problems. You can understand that Russia, if you talk about, is also facing a demographic crisis like the other parts of the developed countries. So very clearly Russia is experiencing what? It is experiencing population decline, and also it is facing the problem of population aging. And we know that various efforts have been taken by Russia to increase their fertility, but ultimately none of them, if you talk about, have bared any results. And this is one of the reasons why Russia has been forced to rely on more and more in migration to maintain that demographic balance. ठीक है. So there is essentially the case of the demographic crisis. Okay, so one thing is pretty much clear, that despite sophisticated technology that Russia has, because of its economic and demographic weaknesses, ठीक है, and other, एक और अगर हम बात कर सकते हैं, it is the case of its geography, which is the traditional criticism of the Heartland theory, वो भी लिख दो. So you talk about that geography. If you talk about, although it is vast, although vast in size, we know that Russia is full of very extreme physiographic conditions. Extreme physiographic conditions. So because of all these factors, in fact geography में और भी चीज लिख सकते हो कि another issues like the access to the sea. So one of the areas where it has access to the sea is the Black Sea. One of the other areas, if you talk about the only access open throughout the year. So you know कि यहाँ पर एक पोर्ट है मेजर रशिया का, रोस्टोव, which is open port throughout the year. And now because it has annexed the Crimean Peninsula, so that will be also accessible to it. But if you talk about others are located where? One is in the North Sea. If you talk about along the eastern coast, all of these, if you talk about, or if you talk about the Baltic Sea coastline, all of these are frozen for large part of the year. So again, it is very heavily reliant on that Black Sea and the Crimean Peninsula. That was one of the reasons you can understand that why it had to attack Ukraine. So attacking Ukraine actually was more of a kind of self-defense, you can say, on Russia's part. Okay. So it was answering the aggressiveness which was being shown by the NATO forces. So these are the problems. In fact, we can say, in fact, this is the reason Russia has been great supporter of multipolarity in the world, and thus you find that it is actively involved in various multilateral forums, including one which is becoming very assertive these days, is the case of BRICS, including the BRICS. In fact, you can understand that in fact, Russia has developed a great partnership with China in this regard, where it has also allowed China to take the lead, okay, which is very clear in the forums like SCO. Okay. So if you talk about that has been the case, So the first thing which we were talking about, that the threat posed by the Heartland, that is the Russia to the west, this is more of perceptional than real. ठीक है, so इस चीज को मेंशन कर सकते हैं. Thus the idea that the Heartland that is Russia poses big threat to the West is more perceptional. More perceptional. Thus, when the Heartland theory is used in its literal sense, it is found that its utility has declined. Okay, so this is our first part. Then from here I'll start writing and I'll say, however, if we look at the essence of the Heartland theory, that is the concept of pivot area, comma, it is found to be applicable and increasingly, you can use the keywords of the question को use कर सकते हो. So, and is gaining importance once again, and thus is gaining importance once again. So now you talk about how it is gaining importance once again. तो सबसे पहले एक चीज हम यहाँ पर लिख देंगे, the concept of pivot area. So we will say that pivot area refers to an area which poses threat to the sovereignty and integrity of the West. ठीक है, of the West. Historically, such threats have emerged from regions located between East Central Asia to Caucasus and एशिया माइनर टर्की वाला जो रीजन है, एंड एशिया माइनर. Thus it is clear that pivot area is not fixed, but its position has changed historically. So thus if we make, if we use this concept of pivot area of Mackinder, we can see several threats emerging to the west, not only in the geographical space, but also in other domains like economic and cyberspaces. So we can apply what we are trying to say, that you can use this concept of Mackinder's theory, the concept of pivot, not only in geographical space, but also in economic and cyberspace. So once we have written, we can say application of concept of pivot area in contemporary geographical space. So we can definitely say that it is clear that the pivot area seems to have shifted to East Asia. Western scholars or Western geopoliticians see China as a much bigger threat than Russia ever was. Then you talk about the characteristics of China. China has second largest population in the world, along with the second largest economy. Technologically, China has grown has grown exponentially in recent times. China is still what? China is, it is still the manufacturing heartland of the world. So आज की डेट में हम मेड इन चाइना की बात करते थे. नाउ देर इज मेड इन चाइना 2.0, second version of made in China, where China has also started to produce very sophisticated technology. पहले क्या होता था कि वो sophisticated जो technologies होती थी, they were designed where they were designed in Western countries and they were just manufactured in China. Now China is also involved in designing of those technologies because it has developed its own technology. You can see the cases of Huawei and other companies, like for example, which are producing electronic vehicles everywhere. If you look into, if you talk about the case of semiconductor industry, China has grown enormously in terms of technology. Okay. Other steps have been taken by China. Other steps, China has been very aggressive in developing the Belt and Road Initiative, where it has tried to revive its silk routes. So, there is the land silk route, there is the मरीन सिल्क रूट. ये डायग्राम मैंने यहाँ पर दिया हुआ है, इस डायग्राम को बना देना वहाँ पर. सो दिस इज द डायग्राम. सो देर इज द ओवरलैंड route of Belt and Road Initiative, which is mentioned by this blue color, and then there is the maritime route of Belt and Road Initiative. So this diagram has to be made here. Similarly, if we talk about other things, like China has developed a very comprehensive string of pearls policy. String of pearls policy, if we talk about, उसका भी डायग्राम मैंने यहाँ पर दे रखा है. So this is the diagram of the string of pearls policy. So you show how the string of pearls have been created by China, whether if you talk about starting from Hong Kong or other places, whether if you talk about Chittagong की बात कर लो, चाहे वो हम्बन टोटा हो, माले हो, ग्वादर हो, ठीक है. So all of these you show, and also show how these are along the areas of these shipping lanes. These are the major shipping lanes of the world, ठीक है, which connect the Indian Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. So how it is trying to control the oil shipping lanes of the world. In fact, in recent times, China has also taken steps to decrease its reliance from the energy, oil energy. What China has done, now the use of China, if we talk about in case of renewable energy share in the energy basket of China has reached 50%. So it has been very, very aggressive. And this is the kind of pivot which is clearly, if you talk about, which is a danger to the West. And Western scholars also see this as a danger. So you can understand this is also very, very perceptible in many of the steps which have been taken. For example, in recent times, USA has banned Chinese electronic vehicles. Okay. Others, if you know that their USA China problems in trade continue. Okay. There is a kind of standoff between the two in Africa is taking place. So all of these you can essentially talk about, and uh, between the West and China, okay, in Africa. So all of these can very clearly show us, these are clear evidences to show that the pivot area has shifted in recent times. So now it is not located in the Heartland, it is located where? In the Rimland. So that is one. Then I'll say what was the heading? So I can say application of the concept of pivot area in economic space. In the economic space. So if we go beyond the geographical space, even we can see that the concept has its applicability in economic space. So in economic space, this is a threat posed to the supremacy of dollar. So, one of the reasons why America has been able to assert itself in the world and maintain its supremacy is the supremacy of dollar, because all the trade in the world is being done in dollar. So you can understand, now there is a movement going on. There is a movement in process, which is the case of de-dollarization is going on. And this de-dollarization, if you talk about, it has become very, if you talk about aggressive with emergence of BRICS as a platform. So many of these BRICS countries, for example, if you talk about Russia, China trade, if we look at 90% of this trade is done in what? It is done in domestic currency. Domestic currency. Similarly, if you talk about Russia, India trade, again over 50% of it is again done in domestic currency. Okay. In recent times, even the oil exporting nations have been apprehensive in use of dollar. Okay. So there is a very big threat emerging even in the economic space, and you can understand that if there is de-dollarization in the world taking place, then the recovery of the supremacy of the West, it will be a bygone era. Nobody will talk about it. Okay. So that is the case. Similarly, application of the concept of pivot area in cyberspace. So, in cyberspace also, there has been a cyber warfare going on in the world, and most of the threats emerge from most of the cyber attacks, if you look into, emerge from Russia and China. Russia and China. Here also what we find, there is a movement. There is a demand that internet should be controlled by all and not only by USA, which is the present case. Which is the present case. ठीक है. सो हमने दिखाया यहाँ पर तीन तरीके से. We have tried to show that how the concept which was given, that is still applicable, and thus we can come to the conclusion here. Finally we can conclude using the words of the question. In fact, so we can say, thus it is clear that when the concept of pivot area given by the Heartland theory is used, it becomes increasingly important to understand the contemporary geopolitics. ठीक है. आई होप इट इज क्लियर नाउ. सो देखो, बात ये है कि if you just go by, like for example, I have seen when we gave this question in the test, we have seen कि students क्या कर रहे हैं कि जो ultimately इधर उधर थोड़ा बहुत बुक्स में लिखा है या कुछ न्यूज़पेपर में कुछ एक आइडिया आ गया कि किस तरह से रशिया का इमरजेंस हो रहा है, एंड अगेन Heartland theory is becoming relevant, or using ChatGPT etc. They are just writing a one way answer. Okay, so this answer which we have talked about, it is much more comprehensive, and it ultimately looks at the relevance of this theory from a more broader perspective and more deeper perspective. ठीक है. Hopefully what we were talking about, it is clear to you. Please tell me so that we can continue to our next question. Saurabh here is asking, on resource perspective, melting of Arctic will provide edge to Russia in future. Saurabh, this is just a speculation which the world is talking about. If the things how they are panning out, if you look at the scenario, one thing is very clear: there are more problems associated with global warming. Okay, then if you talk about the advantages, it can lead to drastic changes in the climatic systems. And Russia is one of the areas which can ultimately, you can understand, it can bear the brunt. Okay, there will be so much melting of the ice taking place. It would create various type of hazardous situations. And again, if you talk about Russia, will be very much affected by it. And you can understand बहुत सारी सब ये सब speculation है. Like for example, if you talk about this scenario, melting of ice, if you're talking about, can I say that in recent times there is a very clear cut indication कि there is the amok, if you talk about Atlantic meridional overturning circulations, they are slowing down and they are expected to stop. And as we have seen, or as we will see later on, that if they are stopping, then what will happen? Ultimately, we will be finding that the scenario, if you talk about of that part of the Arctic, the surrounding areas of the Arctic, if you talk about, they will become very, very cold. So, northern hemisphere, beyond the temperate region, it will become very, polar subpolar regions will become very cold. Okay. So there might not be so much melting of ice as you expect. So most of these things are speculation. When we are talking about the geopolitics, no doubt, if you talk about, you have to focus more on the recent things which are going. I hope it is clear, Saurabh. आगे बढ़ते हैं, क्वेश्चन नंबर 2 पर आते हैं. How does Nicholas Spikeman's Rimland theory apply to contemporary geopolitical tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, especially considering the rise of China? Express your views. So, if we look at this question, again, it is a more direct question about the Spikeman theory. And you know that Spikeman theory, it is talking about the case of not the Heartland, but it is talking about the case of Rimland. So you can see this yellow regions are essentially the Rimland. So for Spikeman, as we understand that Spikeman was essentially who? He was a American. Okay. So he has written his theory from the perspective of America. No doubt it is also applicable to West, because West essentially follows the case of, if you talk about the policy of America, it is very aligned, the policy of America. ठीक है. सो अगर हम इसको इस पर्सपेक्टिव में देखें कि इंडो पैसिफिक रीजन के पर्सपेक्टिव में अगर हम इसको देखें, तो नंबर ऑफ थिंग्स वी कैन डेफिनेटली राइट आउट डाउन हियर. सो वी आर मोर कंसर्न्ड अबाउट दिस पार्ट, दिस इंडो पैसिफिक रीजन. सो यहां पर हम स्टार्ट कर सकते हैं with an introduction, and we can say that Spikeman's Rimland theory asserts that the pivot area, so what he did, he modified the same concept of Heartland. So he asserts that the pivot area is not the Heartland but the Rimland. Then I'll come to the main body, और यहाँ पर सबसे पहले काम क्या करना है, I'll make the diagram of what is essentially the Rimland. We find that the Rimland theory has great application in understanding modern or contemporary is a better word rather than modern. So contemporary geopolitics, especially from the Asia Pacific and China's rise perspective. ठीक है. सो इफ यू टॉक अबाउट ये एप्लीकेशंस, बहुत सारे तरीके के एप्लीकेशंस की बात कर सकते हैं. सो इंडो पैसिफिक रीजन के कंटेक्स्ट में हमें लिखना है. सो आज की डेट में अगर हम देखें तो देयर इज अ वी कैन टॉक अबाउट द strategic importance of maritime routes. ठीक है. So if you talk about the case of Indo-Pacific region, it encompasses some of the most critical maritime choke points. In the world. ठीक है. इंक्लूडिंग, तो ये जो इम्पोर्टेंट मैरीटाइम चोक पॉइंट्स हैं, दिस इंक्लूड्स द एरियाज लाइक द केस ऑफ स्ट्रेट ऑफ मलक्का. ये मैप में बना करके दिखाना है. ठीक है. साउथ चाइना सी, एंड द केस ऑफ द इंडियन ओशन. सो जो अभी हमने देखा था, sorry, that's a diagram. So in this case you talk about these choke points. So you know कि ये स्ट्रेट ऑफ मलक्का बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है. ये साउथ चाइना सी का जो रीजन है, इट इज़ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. दिस इंडियन ओशन पर्टिकुलरली, इफ यू टॉक अबाउट स्टेट ऑफ हॉर्मज, इफ यू टॉक अबाउट अभी जो प्रॉब्लम चल रही है रेड सी में. ठीक है. सो ये सब इफ यू टॉक अबाउट इंडो पैसिफिक रीजन के अंतर्गत आते हैं. ठीक है. सो इनफैक्ट वी कैन से दैट टुडे इफ यू टॉक अबाउट today around 60% of global maritime trade passes through the South China Sea. Through the South China Sea, which shows it's important. ठीक है. So which makes it very pivotal from the perspective of international commerce and energy supplies के perspective में. ठीक है. In fact, you can understand this is one of the reasons why you can see the case of China's recent assertiveness with respect to the South China Sea should be seen in this perspective. ठीक है. So that is first thing. So again, if you talk about this clearly, clearly shows that the Spikeman idea of the increasing significance of maritime mobility. So, Spikeman differed from Heartland theory from Mackinder's view that he saw that along with land-based force, maritime mobility was also important. So, increasing significance of maritime mobility. So, clearly shows the Spikeman idea of increasing significance of maritime mobility is crucial to control contemporary geopolitics. ठीक है, so ये फर्स्ट पॉइंट हो गया. देन सेकेंड पॉइंट पे आ जाते हैं, एंड दिस इज अ वेरी क्लियरली द केस ऑफ चाइना's Belt and Road Initiative and String of Pearls Policy. China's Belt and Road Initiative and String of Pearls Policy. So you can understand both these diagrams which are there. एक ही डायग्राम में बना करके दिखाना है तो वो भी दिखा सकते हो. It is up to you. So both of them have to be shown. You can simplify the overland route. बहुत सारे simplified diagrams भी इंटरनेट पे अवेलेबल हैं, तो you can use them. So that is basically you both of them you show. ठीक है. So it is pretty much clear कि अगर हम देखें तो China is trying to develop what through this Belt and Road Initiative. ठीक है. China is developing two routes. One is the land-based route and other is the maritime route consolidation China is trying to do. Okay, so tell me, does it aligns with the Spikeman's idea? And what was the Spikeman idea? That there will be increasing significance of, so there will be in fact both land power along with maritime mobility is important to become global power. Important to become a global power. ठीक है. एंड इसीलिए ये यहाँ पर हम देख सकते हैं चाइना इज डूइंग दिस इन बोथ द केसेस. ठीक है. यू नो कि बेल्ट एंड रोड इनिशिएटिव चाइना इसलिए बना रहा है लैंड बेस्ड बिकॉज इट इज fearful of the threat that US poses or the West poses to its energy supplies which are passing from the Indian Ocean to ultimately towards South China Sea, ठीक है, and into China. So it wants to develop alternative routes. Also, second important reason, if you talk about, is very clear that if you talk about the case of China, China also understands that the Central Asian region if you talk about, it has vast resources are present in the Central Asian region, and with its Belt and Road Initiative, it will not only provide alternative route, but what it will also do, but it has the potential to lead to consolidation of the Rimland region. So consolidation of the Rimland region, which was the greatest fear of the pikeman. So if you have read the theory, you must be aware that Spikeman was very, very clear that in any case, the US strategy should be to ensure that the Rimland is not consolidated. Because if it becomes consolidated, it has both the land-based resources availability and it also has several ports and thus which provide the mobility, maritime mobility. Okay. So again, that is the case. Then you can understand that third, you can talk about the case of India's response की भी बात कर सकते हैं यहाँ पर. So India's response is in the form of Act East policy and naval expansion. And the case of naval expansion. So India, if you talk about recognizing the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific has responded to the growing influence of China in this region in the form of its Act East policy. In the form of its Act East policy. It is also, if you talk about, so India is now seeking to strengthen its position in Indian Ocean and Southeast Asian region. In fact, India has created its own string of pearls policy. Okay. So India has created its own string of pearls policy. In fact, what it has done, it has aligned with other powers, with other regional powers. Like for example, Japan is one such power, Australia, क्वाड के बारे में सुना होगा तुमने, यूएस, ठीक है, थ्रू इनिशिएटिव्स लाइक क्वाड. So quad is the quadrilateral security dialogue which they have initiated. So it is a strategic grouping aimed at countering China's influence in the Indo-Pacific region. Okay. So again, it is what? It is clear reflection that the contemporary geopolitics is on the lines of Rimland concepts. ठीक है. Similarly, you can definitely talk about the case of US policy. So USA Indo-Pacific strategy. तो अगर इसमें भी देखें तो यूएसए की जो इंडो पैसिफिक स्ट्रैटेजी है, इट इज रिलेटेड विद द कंटेनमेंट ऑफ चाइना पॉलिसी. तो यूएस ने भी बहुत सारे, यहाँ पर देखोगे तो सिनेरियोज बना के रखे हुए हैं. लाइक फॉर एग्जांपल, इफ यू लुक इनटू, देयर इज द केस ऑफ हियर Japan, South Korea, Philippines, if you talk about here, Singapore, if you talk about, then if you talk about यहाँ पर, there is Diego Garcia is there, then in the Middle East, UAE, Saudi Arabia. So US has also what? It has tried to surround this region. And it is a case of containment of China. In fact, it was the case of containment of communism policy, which is extension of the containment of communism policy, which was the policy of US. So that is also you can definitely talk about. So the US, if you talk about policy, is dependent upon that. ठीक है. तो इसी तरह से यूएस ने क्या किया है, एक पैक्ट किया है इन रिसेंट टाइम्स में, यू माइट बी अवेयर, दैट इज रेफर्ड टू एज द AUKUS पैक्ट. तो ये AUKUS पैक्ट क्या है? इट इज अ डिफेंस पैक्ट between countries which are Australia, UK and USA. ठीक है. सो ये बेसिकली क्या करता है फर्दर, दिस एग्रीमेंट इंक्लूड्स प्रोविजन ऑफ न्यूक्लियर पावर्ड submarines to Australia so as to enhance its capacity in Indo-Pacific maritime region. ठीक है. सो वन थिंग इज वेरी वेरी क्लियर. अब इन सब चीज़ों से हम बात कर सकते हैं. वी कैन अल्टीमेटली कम टू आवर कंक्लूजन दैट द सिचुएशन ऑफ द जियोपॉलिटिक्स of Indo-Pacific, along with rising influence of China, is testimony to the fact that the principles of Rimland theory are still applicable. applicable. ठीक है, so that is basically the case of this theory. I hope it is clear. Yes, you can give space to Sagar project. No doubt about this. Yeah. देखो, I am giving some examples. You can add to those examples. The only problem is the lack of the amount of space that you'll be getting to write. ठीक है, आगे बढ़ते हैं, क्वेश्चन नंबर 3 पर आते हैं. And so these are the two topics related, two questions related with Heartland and Rimland theories. Then आगे बढ़ते हैं. एक चीज याद रखना, I have shown you in the class yesterday itself in the class ki how your basics are very weak. Here when I am discussing the Heartland theory and the Rimland theory, I haven't discussed the basics of it. I have discussed the concepts, some of the important concepts. Many of you might not have the clarity about the pivot concept, but now you have clarity about what is the pivot concept or pivot area concept. ठीक है, but understand that कि वो डायग्राम्स, बेसिक डायग्राम्स हो गए, या फिर अदर थिंग्स इफ यू टॉक अबाउट द बेसिक्स which need to be written, because the questions can be sometimes very simple. And it is very surprising to me that students tend to do what? They tend to mess up particularly in those simple questions. And that becomes the primary reason why they don't score good marks. ठीक है, क्योंकि ज्योग्राफी में सब लोग इंसुलर चीजों को पढ़ने में लगे हुए हैं. ठीक है, जो कोर है, कोर इज नॉट बीइंग फोकस. सो हियर आई हैव नॉट कवर्ड द बेसिक्स ऑफ द थ्योरी. यू हैव टू डू इट बाय योरसेल्फ. आई होप आई एम क्लियर. Okay, so now moving on to question number 3. Question number 3 simple सा present a classification of frontiers and boundaries. ठीक है, तो इसके लिए एक्चुअली मैंने आंसर दे रखा है उसी फीड बुक में. एक हैंड रिटन आंसर है, इट इज वेल रिटन, सो दैट विल डू एक्चुअली. ठीक है, सो प्रेजेंट अ क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ फ्रंटियर्स एंड बाउंड्रीज. So frontiers and boundaries have usually been acknowledged in terms of their geographical relationship to the human and physical landscape through which they pass. ठीक है, फिर उसके बाद हम मेन बॉडी पे, दैट वाज एसेंशियली आवर इंट्रोडक्शन. देन देयर इज द मेन बॉडी. So main body की बात करें, while boundaries have been loosely defined as linear and occur where the vertical interfaces between the state sovereignties intersect the surface of the earth. So they are linear boundaries. ठीक है. Frontiers in contrast are zonal and therefore contain various geographical features and frequently even पॉपुलेशंस. तो यहां पर मेन बॉडी में आते ही सबसे पहले मैंने क्या लिखा? दोनों की डेफिनेशंस लिखते दिया. ठीक है, अब बिकॉज द क्वेश्चन इज टॉकिंग अबाउट क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ फ्रंटियर्स एंड बाउंड्रीज. ठीक है, सो सबसे पहले बात करते हैं क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ फ्रंटियर्स. फ्रंटियर्स आर मोर ओल्डर फिनोमेना. So there can be various type of frontiers. One category of frontier is political and settlement frontiers. ठीक है, so political frontiers क्या होते हैं? Political frontiers determine the limits of a state according to the expansion and reduction in area due to political aggression like invasion, war, etc. ठीक है, so when such kind of situations are emerging, war is taking place or invasion is taking place, so that is basically what the frontiers which can be formed as a result of that, they are referred to as the political frontier. While expansion of settlement, normally if you talk about, suppose an area was vacant and settlement is progressing, keep progressing in that area into previously an uninhabited area within the boundaries of state, happens along the settlement frontier. So that is how these are two are different. So for example, expansion of the Russian state into Kazakhstan was associated with political frontier, while the colonization of the interiors of Australia, because you know when Europeans reached Australia, they were primarily located where? They were primarily located in the eastern part. Slowly, what happened? They kept on shifting towards the west, was involved in the advancement of settlement frontiers. Okay, so that is one of the aspects of frontiers. So that is one type if you talk about of classification. Then दूसरे तरह का भी classification हो सकता है. Like for example, one classification can be on the basis of inclusion or exclusion. So there can be frontiers of inclusion हो सकते हैं. So frontiers of inclusion are associated with the assimilation of indigenous population in areas over which the frontiers passes. Like for example, the Arab frontiers. While the segregation is characteristics of the frontiers of exclusion. ठीक है, तो वो क्या करते हैं? एक्सक्लूड कर देते हैं, सेग्रीगेट कर देते हैं. So resistance to assimilation was characteristic of the North American Boer frontiers. Such resistance can come from either the indigenous population or the colonists. So they did not wanted to include them. ठीक है, so that was the frontiers which were present at that time. There is no such kind of frontiers present today. Then if you talk about, there is dynamic frontiers are the ones which are in motion and involve continuous colonization of new territories. They may become static. Okay, so they are static frontiers. When the advance is checked by environmental barriers, like or if effective resistance presented by indigenous people or the lack of colonists. So in such case, these will be referred to as what? They will be referred to as the static frontiers. So dynamic frontiers, अगर हम आज की डेट में देखें तो you can understand that hardly such a situation exists, because today there is the conception of nation states. ठीक है. In the past you can find that such kind of dynamic frontiers were there, like Australia का भी हमने केस लिया, America का केस, all these were dynamic frontiers. As Australians would have reached to the west, the physical factors would have environmental barriers like oceans, mountains would have been present, and they would have become what? Static frontiers. Okay, so that is one. Then another classification is when we are talking about the frontiers of contact. So would facilitate peaceful intercourse between the states along the frontier. Like for example, India Nepal का जो frontier है, वहाँ पर तराई region is present as the frontier region. And if you talk about Madhesis are living in those Tarai region, so it is an area where there is peaceful interaction, intercourse which is taking place. So that is the frontiers of contact. Okay. While there is what? There is frontiers of separation, which involves zone of difficult terrain and scarce population, which was said to minimize the risk of war by separating political enemies. For example, if you talk about Sahara Desert, is one such frontier of separation which has acted in this ancient times. India में भी अगर हम देखें तो एक तरह से Thar Desert is what? It is the frontier of separation between India and Pakistan. So these are some of the classifications of frontiers. Then if you talk about classification of boundaries, okay, where we can talk about various types of boundaries. So in geography, boundaries separate different regions of the earth. Okay, so there can be various types of classification. There can be physical boundaries. So these are naturally occurring barriers between two areas. For example, there can be river boundaries, like the Rio Grande River forms large part of boundary between Mexico and USA. Okay, St. Lawrence River forms the eastern boundary between USA and Canada. Similarly, if you talk about mountain ranges, boundary between France and Spain follows the peaks of Pyrenees mountains, while Alps separate it from Italy. India के case में you can understand Himalayas present between China and India. ठीक है. Similarly, others like in state of Gibraltar is the boundary between the southwestern Europe and northwestern Africa. ठीक है. So there can be one category of boundaries which are physical boundaries. Then if you talk about, there can be another category of boundaries which are political boundaries. ठीक है. So political boundaries are dividing lines between countries, states, provinces, and are often referred to as borders. ठीक है. They can change over time via wars, treaties and trades. ठीक है. So for example, after World War II, the map of Europe was almost completely redrawn. Other example लिखना है तो you can talk about the phenomena of balkanization, which occur Balkan Peninsula में जो रीड्रॉइंग ऑफ बाउंड्रीज हुआ है ड्यूरिंग द कोल्ड वॉर एरा. ठीक है. देन थर्ड कैटेगरी ऑफ बाउंड्रीज आर the maritime boundaries which are mentioned in the UN clause, establishes maritime boundaries of no more than 200 nautical miles from the nation's coastline. ठीक है. So you already know कि यहाँ पर डायग्राम बनाना है. यहाँ पर मैंने डायग्राम नहीं बना हुआ है, बट डायग्राम बना करके दिखा दो. द बाउंड्रीज विच आर देयर, यू पर्टिकुलरली मेंशन द इंटरनल वाटर्स. ठीक है. ठीक है. और EEZ सेवरल सच UN क्लॉज में जो बाउंड्रीज मेंशन है वो सब मेंशन कर दो. अदर बाउंड्रीज, एक क्लासिफिकेशन हार्टशॉन ने दिया है. सो हार्टशॉन सजेस्ट यूजफुल क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ बाउंड्रीज अकॉर्डिंग टू द डेवलपमेंट ऑफ कल्चरल लैंडस्केप. सो अकॉर्डिंग टू हार्टशॉन, there can be antecedent boundaries which have preceded the full development of associated cultural landscape. For example, Himalayas have been present there, separating the Indic culture from the Chinese culture even before the state of India and state of China were formed in modern times. Then if you talk about, there can be subsequent and superimposed boundaries can also be there. They post date the development of cultural landscapes and can be described in relation to their degree of conformity with the established cultural patterns. Where this conformity is notably lacking, ठीक है, those type of boundaries are referred to as the superimposed boundaries. ठीक है. So that is one type of boundary which is there. So you know, इसके बहुत सारे examples हैं. Throughout you will be finding such examples. In Africa would be present superimposed boundaries. India में अगर हम superimposed boundary का example दें तो in the eastern margin, the debate which is the conflict between India and China with respect to Tawang, it is an example of a superimposed boundary, because Tawang, if you talk about, and Tibet both had Buddhist culture, and thus there was a kind of continuity which was there. It was superimposed. ठीक है. Very frequently, you know, superimposed boundaries follow the latitudes and longitudes because they were drawn where they were drawn in, if you talk about rooms. ठीक है. Then if you talk about other classification हो सकता है linguistic boundaries, economic, social. ठीक है. For example, the borders developed between the developed country of USA and underdeveloped country of Mexico is an economic as well as political boundary. ठीक है. So there are many, if you talk about type of classifications which can be there. अब देखो, जनरली मुझे लगता है कि ये दोनों क्वेश्चन एक साथ नहीं आएंगे. ठीक है. सो प्रेजेंट अ क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ, या तो फ्रंटियर्स आएगा या तो फिर बाउंड्रीज आएगा. ठीक है. तो बिकॉज आई ट्राई टू प्रोवाइड some content to you both on both classification of frontiers and classification of boundaries. इसलिए इस आंसर को लिखने में there was less space which was there. Okay, and that is why this answer is lacking if you talk about diagrams. ठीक है. आइडियली मुझे क्या करना है कि जो मैं ये एग्जांपल्स दे रहा हूं, उन एग्जांपल, इंडो नेपाल का एग्जांपल दिया तो वहां पर दिखाया कि तराई रीजन कौन सा है, वो कौन सा फ्रंटियर जोन है. ठीक है. सहारा डेजर्ट को मेंशन किया तो एक छोटा सा डायग्राम यहां पर बना करके दिखा दिया कि हाउ सहारा डेजर्ट वाज अ फ्रंटियर ऑफ सेपरेशन. ठीक है. So again, if you talk about in this fashion, if you talk about, you have to write this answer. और जब ये अलग अलग पूछा जाएगा तो you will have enough space to actually make those diagrams. I hope I am clear. Tell me friends. so that we can move on to our next question, question number 4. तो क्वेश्चन नंबर 4 की तरफ बढ़ते हैं. अब ये थोड़ा सा बेसिक, इफ यू टॉक अबाउट, एक क्वेश्चन है जो पूछा गया है, एंड एज आई टोल्ड यू कि इसमें व्हाट यू आर फाइंडिंग इज देयर इज स्कार्सिटी ऑफ कंटेंट. ठीक है. सो मेनी टाइम्स स्टूडेंट्स विल कम टू मी कि सर ये इंटरनेशनल लॉज ऑफ इंटरनेशनल बाउंड्रीज एंड फ्रंटियर्स हैं क्या. ठीक है. सो हियर आई हैव गिवन सम इंपॉर्टेंट इंटरनेशनल लॉज विच आर रिलेटेड विद द बाउंड्रीज एंड फ्रंटियर्स. ठीक है. सो इसमें हम बात करते हैं एक करके. तो सबसे पहला जो है दैट इज नेचर ऑफ बाउंड्री. दिस इज द फर्स्ट लॉ. सो इंटरनेशनल लॉज, एक्चुअली देखो इंटरनेशनल लॉज कैसे होते हैं. दीज आर लॉज विच हैव बीन which have become a kind of traditions over a period of time. These were actually judgments with respect to, or they were related with the treaties which occurred between the two countries. ठीक है. Or many times when there were disputes, the countries went to ICJ, ठीक है, International Court of Justice, and the judgments which came, they ultimately over a period of time they became precedent, and as they became precedent, they over a time they became law. ठीक है. सो दैट इज बेसिकली व्हाट आर दोज इंटरनेशनल लॉज. ठीक है. सो इफ यू टॉक अबाउट द नेचर ऑफ द बाउंड्री, बाउंड्री इज व्हाट? बाउंड्री इज एन इमेजिनरी लाइन दैट सेपरेट्स, ठीक है, टेरिटरी ऑफ वन स्टेट फ्रॉम अनदर और फ्रॉम unappropriated land or the open sea. Boundaries have both legal and practical significance in international law as they define the territorial limits within which a state can exercise its sovereignty. So these are not just boundaries, they are sovereign boundaries. Historically, boundaries served the defensive purpose, marking line beyond which foreign interlopers would risk conflict. However, they now play a crucial role in allocating sovereign jurisdiction of the nations. A boundary's precise location may be determined by treaties or agreements or often involves complex legal disputes. Like for example, recent times में देखें तो Cameroon versus Nigeria case, which addressed the sovereignty and boundary demarcation of the Bakassi Peninsula. ठीक है. So first is the definition of boundaries. The international law describes what boundaries are. So very clearly it recognizes that these just don't only represent territorial limits. दो इसमें keywords use करने, एक तो territorial limits को define करता है, but not only that, it also defines the sovereign jurisdiction between the two states. ठीक है. Then if you talk about the second is the principle of uti possidetis. ठीक है. सो प्रिंसिपल ऑफ ओटी पोसिडेटिस एक प्रिंसिपल इवॉल्व हुआ वेयर द स्टेट्स दैट न्यूली इंडिपेंडेंट स्टेट्स शुड रिटेन द प्री एग्जिस्टिंग एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव बाउंड्रीज एज established during colonization. It emerged as a legal norm to ensure peaceful transitions after independence and was notably applied in Latin America and Africa. ठीक है. The principle was enshrined in the 1963 Charter of Organization of African Unity and reaffirmed in international jurisprudence. For example, in case of Burkina Faso Mali case of 1986, although it maintains stability, what has happened? It sometimes conflicts with the right to self-determination, as seen in disputes like the breakup of Yugoslavia, where colonial boundaries were retained despite the ethnic tensions. ठीक है. So can you understand? अगर मुझे ये principle of uti possidetis की बात करनी है, तो there is the dispute of Tawang between in the eastern margins or the eastern boundary of India and China. ठीक है. So India definitely says that principle of uti possidetis should apply. That means the boundaries which were formed during the colonial period, those boundaries if you talk about should apply. Okay. Then if you talk about another law is related with the ideas of delimitation and demarcation. So what is delimitation? Delimitation refers to the process of legally defining a boundary through agreements or court's decision, typically by using maps and coordinates. Demarcation, on the other hand, is actually physically marking the boundary on ground. So जब हम कोर्ट्स में बैठ करके या फिर रूम्स में बैठ करके डिसाइड कर रहे हैं बाउंड्री, दैट इज डिलिमिटेशन. डिमार्केशन ऑन द अदर हैंड involves physically marking the boundary on the ground using beacons, pillars, or other geographical markers. An example of this process is the Eritrea-Ethiopia boundary dispute. ठीक है, where delimitation was achieved by Eritrea-Ethiopia Boundary Commission, but lack of cooperation prevented the demarcation. ठीक है. So that is the distinction. There is a distinction between delimitation and demarcation. So the law is very clear with respect to this, that demarcation ideally should not depart from what has been decided in the delimitation. So sometimes it may happen because delimitation is being done in the room, so they might not be aware about the physical reality of the space. So in that case, what is there? When the demarcation is being done, if it is departing from what is mentioned in the delimitation, it has to take permission of both the states. If both of them are agreeing, then only what will happen? The demarcation will follow. And this same thing happened in case of the Eritrea-Ethiopia boundary dispute, where the commission had delimited the boundary, but when it came to demarcation, ultimately it was prevented because that was the lack of cooperation with respect to many of the real aspects which were found. Okay. Then if you talk about modes of acquisition of territorial sovereignty. So how states can acquire territorial sovereignty in different areas. Like for example, there are several ways which the international law recognizes, ठीक है, to acquire territorial sovereignty. So for example, इसमें एक है occupation is one way. So claiming an uninhabited area को अगर claim कर लें, like for example terra nullius land, which is uninhabited land. So for example, suppose an island has been formed, ठीक है, in recent times, and this island is what? It is uninhabited, ठीक है, and as it is uninhabited, if it is acquired by certain country, then it can claim its territorial sovereignty with respect to that particular island. Then second, if you talk about, is the case of prescription. ठीक है, prescription if you talk about is acquiring territory through prolonged and uncontested possession. So if suppose in an area there was presence of a country, ठीक है, presence of some countries representatives who were living there for a longer period of time, ultimately if you talk about and it was uncontested by any other, ठीक है, then it is by prescription they can claim that territorial sovereignty. Then if you talk about third is the case of secession, which is transfer of territory through treaties, ठीक है. So अगर प्रिस्क्रिप्शन का इनफैक्ट एक एग्जांपल दूं मैं तुम्हें पहले थर्ड पे जाने से, तो इसका एक एग्जांपल है द केस ऑफ ईस्ट ग्रीनलैंड केस, ठीक है, विच वॉज देयर इन 1933, ठीक है. सो इन ईस्ट ग्रीनलैंड केस, डेनमार्क, if you talk about, successfully claimed the sovereignty over the entire island of Greenland based on its long-standing occupation, ठीक है. Despite Norway was claiming that it should go to Norway, but again because of the if you talk about uncontested possession, it was in the hands of Denmark, and that is why you will see that Greenland, if you talk about, it is considered as the territory of Denmark and not नॉर्वे। ठीक है, और इसका अगर मैं एक एग्जांपल दूं पहले वाले का, तो यू कैन अंडरस्टैंड इन रीसेंट टाइम्स चाइना ने चाइना सी में इट हैज क्रिएटेड सम आइलैंड्स। ठीक है, सो अगेन दैट इज द केस। सिमिलरली इफ यू टॉक अबाउट यूएई हैज क्रिएटेड आइलैंड्स, ठीक है, इन द पर्शियन गल्फ, सो दैट इज एन एग्जाम्पल ऑफ ऑक्यूपेशन। ठीक है, या फिर अगर दूसरा एक एग्जाम्पल है तो आइलैंड ऑफ पाल्मास, दिस वॉज अ डिस्प्यूट विच अकर्ड इन 1928 between USA, if you talk about, and Netherlands. Okay, so USA it claimed the island, arguing that Spain had originally discovered it and transferred the territory to US in the Treaty of Paris. However, the arbiter ruled in favor of Netherlands. So Las Palmas जो island है, it was ruled in favor of Netherlands, which had exercised continuous and peaceful control over that island. ठीक है, so that is basically the case of prescription. Then if you talk about the secession, so secession you can understand कि it is simply if a country decides that it to transfer territory through treaties. Like इसका best example अगर recent times में हम देखें तो the transfer of Russian lands to China. So there was in recent times Russia and China ने अपने boundary dispute को solve किया है, and ये कहाँ पर है, ये सेसेशन कहाँ पर हुआ, इन द ईस्टर्न अमूर region, जहां पर अमूर रिवर is flowing, that is the area where this secession has taken place. ठीक है, then if you talk about, there is the fourth case, accretion. Accretion if you talk about is gaining territory through gradual natural changes such as sediments deposit. ठीक है, so suppose there is a natural change which is taking place कहीं पर माउथ ऑफ द रिवर अगर हम बात करें, तो वहां पर अल्टीमेटली व्हाट इज टेकिंग प्लेस, सेडिमेंट्स आर बीइंग डिपॉजिटेड एंड अ सैंड बार कम्स अबव द सी. सो देन व्हाट विल हैपन, लैंड विल बी फॉर्म्ड, और जो डेल्टा एक्सटेंड होता जा रहा है, ठीक है, दैट इज ऑल्सो फॉर्म्ड एक्रीशन टेकिंग प्लेस थ्रू सेडिमेंट डिपोजिशन. ठीक है, सो अल्टीमेटली in that case the territory if you talk about which is being gained, like अगर इंडिया में वो डेल्टा बढ़ रहा है तो that is what, that is the territory of India becoming. ठीक है, so that is if you talk about the ultimate way through which it is taking place. Then fifth also is there, and fifth का exam is the conquest. So conquest क्या है, historically conquest allowed states to gain territory, but this method is now prohibited under international law, Article 2(4) of UN Charter. The island of Palma's case illustrates how continuous and peaceful display of authority can be sufficient to claim sovereignty. ठीक है, so that is the case of one category of law. Then there is other terms which are mentioned in the international laws, like for example recognition, acquiescence, एस्टॉपल, जोग्राफिकल एंड पॉलिटिकल फैक्टर्स. सो रिकॉग्निशन क्या है यहाँ पर, रिकॉग्निशन इज द अ स्टेट्स एक्नॉलेजमेंट टू अदर सोवरेनिटी ओवर अ टेरिटरी. सो दिस इज बेसिकली रेफर टू एज द रिकॉग्निशन. ठीक है, सो रिकॉग्निशन की बात करें, लाइक द केस ऑफ, यहाँ पर अगर एग्जाम्पल देना है मुझे तो आई कैन गिव द एग्जाम्पल ऑफ द बाउंड्री कमीशन इन केस ऑफ एरिट्रिया एंड इथियोपिया. And Ethiopia boundary dispute. So in Eritrea-Ethiopia boundary dispute, despite the legal delimitations of boundary, the final recognition of sovereignty over certain contested areas remained unresolved because Ethiopia refused to accept the demarcation process. ठीक है, so Ethiopia did not recognize, and thus the boundary case remained is unresolved. ठीक है. Then the second, if you talk about, is the case of acquiescence. So it is implicit consent or the passive acceptance by a state of another's control over disputed territory. ठीक है. So if you talk about, for example, इसका बेस्ट एग्जांपल जो अभी हमने दिया था, इट वाज ईस्ट ग्रीनलैंड केस. ठीक है. सो इट इज अ पैसिव कंसेंट विच हैज बीन गिवन. अगर हम फ्यूचर में देखें तो ऑल्दो दिस डिस्प्यूट इज स्टिल देयर एंड गोइंग ऑन, बट एक तरह से देखें तो we have become very passive with respect to the territories which we have lost in the if you talk about the Ladakh region to China. ठीक है. So China in future can claim those areas as a part of acquiescence, although you know कि dispute चल रहा है इंडिया और चाइना के बीच में, it is disputed territory and China, India is also claiming that. ठीक है. But practically अगर हम देखें तो that is a case of acquiescence कि हम उसमें कुछ भी नहीं कर रहे हैं और देते जा रहे हैं चाइना को. ठीक है. So then there is third, that is estoppel. So estoppel, if you talk about a principle preventing a state from denying the legality of actions it had previously accepted. These principles, along with geographical factors such as rivers and mountains and political consideration, play significant roles in determining the boundary dispute. So a principle preventing a state from denying legality of actions it has previously accepted. In the island of Palma's case, the absence of protest from other states reinforced the Netherlands' sovereignty claims in case of the Palma's case. Then if you talk about sixth point is the intertemporal law and critical date. तो ये इंटरटेम्पोरल लॉ क्या कहता है कि जो भी बाउंड्री डिस्प्यूट है दे शुड बी सीन इन द कंटेक्स्ट ऑफ द टाइम इन विच दोज ट्रीटीज एक्सेट्रा विच वुड हैव बीन टेकन प्लेस. सो द इंटरटेम्पोरल लॉ refers to the legal principle that disputes must be resolved based on the law as it existed at the time the event occurred. The critical date is the moment at which factual evidence is frozen for legal analysis. In the context of boundary disputes, principle of voti possidetis often determines the critical date, such as in case of Burkina Faso Mali case, where ICJ froze the boundaries based on colonial administrative lines at the time of independence. ठीक है. So that is the case of intertemporal law and critical dates. So for example, India also claims this intertemporal law should apply because at that time when this demarcation of the boundaries were being done, the political realities were different. China was one state. But if you talk about, there was the case of Tibet. Tibet at that time was behaving like an independent state. So that time the geopolitical realities, if you talk about, were different. Okay. Then if you talk about right to self-determination. So right to self-determination is a principle of international law that allows people to determine their own political status and pursue economic, social, cultural development. This right can conflict with other principles like voti possidetis, which often preserve existing borders even when they do not align with ethnic or cultural groups. So the Badinter Commission decision during the breakup of Yugoslavia highlighted this tension by prioritizing the existing boundaries over ethnic claims to self-determination. So there is again the established principle. Then if you talk about another law or principle is a common heritage of mankind. So the common heritage of mankind is a principle of international law that designates certain global commons like the deep seabed outer space as the collective property of humanity to be managed for the benefit of all. No state can claim sovereignty over these areas. This principle is enshrined in the United Nations Convention on Law of Seas and reinforces global responsibility for preserving and benefiting from resources like oceans and outer space. Okay? So this is another law of the boundaries. In fact, हम इसमें कुछ और laws भी add कर सकते हैं. Like for example, suppose if I have to add something here, I can definitely talk about, एक पॉइंट मैं ऐड कर सकता हूं रिवर बाउंड्रीज के बारे में. ठीक है. So one point I can add with respect to the river boundaries. So if you talk about river boundaries में जो delimitation होता है, it can be on various bases. Like for example, one way of the delimitation is the case of geographic middle. The case of geographic middle. So this method, if you talk about, defines the boundary is the median line of the river. With each point equidistant from the river shores. ठीक है. So this is one of the most simple, often used approach which is there. Then there is second, that is the boundary where it is used as the thalweg. ठीक है. So you know thalweg of the river क्या होता है? Thalweg is, suppose this is the river. So in this case, suppose this is the deepest point. So the point which will be located above this deepest point, that is, अगर मैं suppose ये river है और इस river के वो सारे वो points को मैं जोड़ दूं, तो this is basically referred to as the channel thalweg. So that means channel thalweg is not necessarily, it is in the middle of the river, but it is not necessarily represents the middle point in the river channel. ठीक है. So very frequently what another method which has been used is the case of channel thalweg. ठीक है. So that is one. Then अगर मैं तीसरा अगर बात करूं, अगर इसका एक एग्जांपल लेना है चैनल थालवे का, तो टू डिटरमाइन बाउंड्री बिटवीन बोट्सवाना एंड नमीबिया के बीच में बाउंड्री बनाना था अराउंड, इफ यू टॉक अबाउट इन केस ऑफ देयर इज अ रिवर, शोब रिवर. ठीक है. सो इन दिस केस आईसीजे ने थालवेग के प्रिंसिपल के बेसिस पर इस बाउंड्री को डिलिमिट किया. ठीक है. सो दैट इज इफ यू टॉक अबाउट एन एग्जांपल. देन थर्ड अगर मैं बात करूं तो इट इज द शोर ऑफ द रिवर बैंक. ठीक है. सो इन दिस इज द रेयर केसेस में ऐसा होता है. ठीक है. वेयर बाउंड्री इज डिफाइंड बाय द शोर और द बैंक ऑफ द रिवर. ठीक है. एंड दिस विल मीन दैट when one state retains control of the entire river, leaving the opposite state with boundary along the shore. ठीक है. और इसका अगर हम एक एग्जाम्पल यहाँ का लें तो देर इज अ एग्जाम्पल ऑफ बाउंड्री बिटवीन टेक्सास एंड द यूनाइटेड स्टेट. ठीक है. एंड यूएसए along the रेड रिवर. ठीक है. which was established by जब इस तरह की जब सिचुएशंस होती हैं तो दे आर ऑलवेज स्टैब्लिश्ड बाय ट्रीटीज, ठीक है, बाय द 1819 स्पेनिश अमेरिकन ट्रीटी। But now you can understand कि Texas has been annexed by US, so it is now part of US, so now it is not the case, ठीक है। So this is the third way which is there, through which it is commonly defined। अब देखो, ये जो मैंने आज जो अभी हमने ये पढ़े हैं बहुत सारे जो principles, we will be finding that we will be applying them when we'll study paper 2। like हमारे paper 2 में there is boundary disputes, so we will be using them। for example, I'll just give you one example। इंडिया और पाकिस्तान के बीच में देर इज अ बॉर्डर डिस्प्यूट अलोंग सर क्रीक, ठीक है। सो सर क्रीक में क्या डिस्प्यूट है? द डिस्प्यूट इज द केस दैट द पाकिस्तान सेज दैट वेयर दैट क्रीक इज लोकेटेड द बाउंड्री शुड बी थ्रू द ईस्टर्न बैंक्स ऑफ दिस क्रीक, ठीक है, बिकॉज पाकिस्तान क्लेम्स दैट देर वॉज अ ट्रीटी बिटवीन द राजा ऑफ सिंध एंड राजा ऑफ गुजरात, ठीक है, to ultimately maintain this as the boundary। but India क्या कहता है कि इंडिया कहता है no, international law says that the boundary should be from where, from the middle। so that means from the Sir Creek इंडिया का क्लेम है कि बाउंड्री इस तरह से मिडिल से जाएगी। so that means half of the territory sovereignty will fall in Pakistan and half will be falling in case of India। so again we can use these concepts when we will be using these concepts when we'll talk about the boundary disputes of India with other countries, ठीक है, like uti possidetis का concept हो गया और others which we have essentially studied। so you can definitely add up here a point which is 9 river boundaries के case में, and one more you can add up which you have already studied in oceanography। I don't need to tell about this, it is the case of maritime boundaries, ठीक है। सो यहां पर जो हम यूएन क्लॉज की बाउंड्रीज पढ़ते हैं वहां पर डायग्राम बना करके यू कैन शो, ठीक है। सो दीज आर द मेन लॉज एंड प्रिंसिपल्स विच आर स्टैब्लिश्ड फॉर बाउंड्रीज एंड फ्रंटियर्स। आई होप इट इज क्लियर फ्रेंड्स। ठीक है, तो ये था आज का डिस्कशन, बंद करते हैं एंड होपफुली दीज टॉपिक्स विल बी क्लियर नाउ टू यू। अब इसमें कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है। इसके अलावा अगर मैं देखूं तो जो हमने क्लास में किया है इसके अलावा बस एक ही तरह का क्वेश्चन जो आता है फ्रॉम दीज टू टॉपिक्स इज विच कैन बी देयर इज द डिफरेंस बिटवीन boundaries and frontiers। this is one category of question which can be asked, ठीक है। इसके अलावा some if you look into the past they have asked some kind of tricky questions पूछे गए हैं एग्जाम में, like for example you know they have asked questions related with कि how sometimes there can be the case of inclusion and there can be some cases of exclusion of the boundaries, how they can be sometimes becoming very inclusive, sometimes they can be becoming very exclusive। so इस तरह के questions पूछे गए हैं, ठीक है। तो वो थोड़े से you can understand कि tricky questions होते हैं, but ये अगर conceptual clarities हैं then what will happen, you will be able to write। like for example can you see this 2021 में this question was asked, boundaries are important in geopolitics, explain, first part, ठीक है। नॉट वेरी डिफिकल्ट, हाउ दे आर इंपॉर्टेंट इन जियोपॉलिटिक्स जो अभी हमने बात किया प्रिंसिपल जो पढ़ा कि हाउ दे नॉट ओनली डिटरमाइन द टेरिटरी बट ऑल्सो व्हाट दे आर डिटरमाइनिंग द sovereignty. So since they are determining sovereignty, how ultimately they'll become important from the perspective of geopolitics. You explain it. ठीक है. What issues develop from the inclusionary and exclusionary aspects of borders? ठीक है. तो अब इसको अगर मुझे समझना है तो कैन यू अंडरस्टैंड कि क्या अभी हमने इंक्लूसिव फ्रंटियर्स और एक्सक्लूसिव फ्रंटियर्स की बात की थी. ठीक है. सो जो बेसिक आइडिया है वो वहीं से इमर्ज होता है. तो इफ यू अंडरस्टैंड व्हाट इज इंक्लूजन एंड व्हाट इज एक्सक्लूजन, देन इफ यू कैन अंडरस्टैंड कि ये आंसर लिखना बहुत ईजी हो जाएगा. तो व्हाट काइंड ऑफ इश्यूज कैन डेवलप. ठीक है. सो इफ दे आर इंक्लूजनरी, ठीक है, द बॉर्डर्स आर इंक्लूजनरी, देन व्हाट विल हैपन, देयर कैन बी peacefulness can be there, or sometimes when they are ultimately forcefully included, then there can be tensions also. ठीक है. So likewise, if you talk about, the answer should have been written. But in general, if you talk about the questions which have been asked, they have been very simple. Like if you look into the others, like in modern times, most of the frontiers have been replaced by boundaries. Explain. So you have to give examples how the boundaries have replaced the frontiers. ठीक है. Question is asking about, explain the reason. So you'll talk about how there is emergence of the sovereign states, United Nations, various of these principles, if you talk about, have emerged, and all of these, if you talk about, are responsible for this change. Then another, like, discuss the genetic classification of boundaries suggested by Hartshorne. So again, as we said, Hartshorne का जो classification है, जो genesis के basis पर कि किस तरह से boundaries emerge होती हैं, that is what he had to mention. It was a 10 marker, so you can understand with examples what is written in the material. You will be able to elaborate and write well. ठीक है. सो ये दोनों टॉपिक्स में केवल और केवल मैंने कुछ चीज़ें नहीं बताई हैं, और वो जो चीज़ें मैंने नहीं बताई हैं, वन थिंग आई हैव नॉट डन इज सम बेसिक्स, लाइक दिस इज वेरी बेसिक. ठीक है. डिफरेंस बिटवीन बाउंड्रीज एंड फ्रंटियर्स. देन इफ यू टॉक अबाउट व्हाट इज द बेसिक tenets of the Heartland theory, Rimland theory, these are very basics. ठीक है. Rest all the questions what we have discussed from that you will be able to answer if you revise it. ठीक है. So goodbye, take care, good night. कल मिलते हैं 12:30 in the class.